Greetings, fellow cultivators. Welcome to Autonova. Remember to like and subscribe to support the journey. Now, let's dive into the next chapter of A Will Eternal. The command medallion was pitch black, and in the very center was the character, Justice, which emanated a bleak and somber air. Even as Bai Xiaochun stared in at it shock, a cold voice echoed out into the workshop. Outer Sect Disciple Bai Xiaochun. After an investigation carried out by the Hall of Justice, it has been confirmed that after being in the sect for several years, you have only accomplished a single mission, to raise a spirit plant. Because of this violation of sect rules, you must participate in a mandatory out-of-sect mission, which begins 3 days from now. From the cold and sinister nature of the voice, it seemed apparent that if Bai Xiaochun refused to comply, he would receive the strictest of punishments. The Hall of Justice. Bai Xiaochun's eyes bulged, and his heart began to pound. At the same time, the command medallion transformed into a black glow, and then vanished. Everything was dead quiet. Bai Xiaochun's face flickered with various emotions as he pulled out his identity medallion. Sure enough, he found that a mandatory mission had been added. He had completely forgotten about the rule about a minimum number of missions required for disciples on a yearly basis. However, the abrupt arrival of the command medallion from the Hall of Justice was something that Bai Xiaochun found very odd. After a moment of thought, he left his workshop, walked out of the medicine concocting pavilion, and headed toward the top of the mountain. Something's not right here. Why do I feel like a cold wind is running down my back? Well, I've been in the sect for years now, and have never taken the initiative to go see the Peak Lord. I might as well go pay my respects and see if I can figure out what's going on. Bai Xiaochun was wrapped up in very important thoughts the entire way up the mountain. Eventually, he found Li Qinghao's Taoist assistant, only to discover that Li Qinghao had been out of the sect for several months. Bai Xiaochun was feeling very bitter, and very nervous. Instead of returning to the medicine concocting pavilion, he went to find Xu Baosai. After all, Xu Baosai knew everything that was going on in the sect, so perhaps he would have some clue about what was going on. Xu Baosai was still an outer sect disciple, and lived on a different part of the mountain than Bai Xiaochun. By now it was evening, and not very many people were out and about. Soon, Bai Xiaochun had arrived outside Xu Baosai's courtyard residence. This residence was not as remote as Bai Xiaochun's, and was clustered together with 7 or 8 others. Now that it was dark, firelight could be seen shining out from several of the courtyards. Bai Xiaochun ducked his head down to make himself inconspicuous. Instead of knocking on the main gate, he flew over the wall, after which he caught sight of Xu Baosai bent over a little notebook, writing. Xu Baosai, he whispered. Xu Baosai was startled, but once he saw who had come, he said, "Oh, hey elder brother Bai." A bit confused, he rose to his feet and invited Bai Xiaochun into his room. "Elder brother Bai, weren't you in secluded meditation in the medicine concocting pavilion?" he asked curiously. "What are you doing out here?" "Xu Baosai, what do you know about the Hall of Justice?" Bai Xiaochun asked immediately. Seeing the grim expression on Bai Xiaochun's face, Xu Baosai could tell that something was wrong, and quickly responded, "The Hall of Justice? Well, there's a southern hall and a northern hall, who administer the 2 different parts of the sect. They oversee the outer sect disciples and servants, but usually don't do anything unless there's been a serious violation of sect rules. If a violation does occur, they have a lot of power. There are all sorts of punishments they can enforce. In fact, they even have the power to execute traitors. Essentially, the Hall of Justice is like a sword hanging over the necks of the outer sect disciples, ensuring that none of us ever dare to violate sect rules. If someone does, and gets noticed by the Hall of Justice, they'll receive swift and severe punishment. Of course, although the Hall of Justice has a lot of power, that power is limited. As long as you don't violate sect rules, then you don't really have to worry about them at all. As usual, Xu Baosai went on to give a very detailed description of the Hall of Justice to Bai Xiaochun, based on everything that he knew. He even went on to tell Bai Xiaochun the grisly fates of some of the disciples who had run afoul of the Hall of Justice. 500 years ago, a traitor rose up within the Spirit Stream sect. The Hall of Justice tracked him down for 7 days before finally killing him and wiping out his soul. 300 years ago, an outer sect disciple flagrantly violated sect rules. Although the Hall of Justice gave him a chance to repent, he ignored it. In the end, the Hall of Justice reported the matter to the sect, and the disciple was punished in the Black Wind Abyss, where to this very day, he is constantly scourged by biting winds. 100 years ago, the Mount Zhou Society planned an armed rebellion. Despite warnings from the Hall of Justice, they refused to back down. When they finally made their move, the Hall of Justice executed all the cultivators from the Mount Zhou Society, sparing only the mortals. As Bai Xiaochun listened to all of this, his expression grew more unsightly than ever, and his heart began to pound. Are you telling me that normally the Hall of Justice gives a warning first, and resorts to serious punishment only if you don't repent? Yeah, exactly. That's one of the limitations placed upon the Hall of Justice. Otherwise, they would have far too much power. By this point, Xu Baosai had guessed that the Hall of Justice must have set their eyes on Bai Xiaochun. However, matters pertaining to the Hall of Justice were sensitive, and Xu Baosai was intelligent enough to look out for his own interests. Therefore, although he told Bai Xiaochun what he knew, he didn't dare to get any more involved than that. In the end, just before Bai Xiaochun was about to leave, Xu Baosai hesitated for a moment as he thought about Bai Xiaochun's skill with plants and vegetation, and then suddenly lowered his voice and asked, "Elder brother Bai, do you happen to know an inner sect disciple from Green Crest Peak named Qian Daijin? He's Chen Fei's older cousin, and he also happens to be a member of the Hall of Justice." After the time it takes an incense stick to burn, Bai Xiaochun left. As he walked along the path in the sect, he looked up at the moon and thought about everything Xu Baosai had said, which only served to confirm what he had already surmised. In the end, he sighed. I didn't offend anyone in the sect, he thought, clenching his jaw. Other than Chen Fei, there's only the fans of Zhou Xinqi. Qian Daijin. Qian Daijin. After returning to the medicine concocting pavilion, he sat down cross-legged in the workshop and looked at the pill furnace. Then his face twitched. It's pretty obvious that me failing to complete a sect mission every year is just an excuse. Something like that wouldn't be noticed unless someone specifically looked into it, and even still, it isn't a very big deal. Besides, I couldn't possibly be the only person in the sect who has done that. Since Qian Daijin is a member of the Hall of Justice, he's using his public office to avenge private grudges. After more thought, Bai Xiaochun's eyes were growing increasingly bloodshot. If I go on this mission, he'll definitely make sure something happens to me at some point. Why else would he go through all the trouble of setting this up? However, he would still have to be careful to make sure the sect doesn't find out. Overall, I still have the initiative. If I ignore the mission order, then I would be falling right into his hands. He would be able to take control of the initiative, using his status in the Hall of Justice to directly punish me. Bai Xiaochun thought about it from many directions, but there was no perfect solution. Eventually, he took out his identity medallion and examined the mission. It only took a moment before he realized there was a familiar name in the mission description. Hu Yunfei? Bai Xiaochun's eyes went wide as he thought back to when he had first become an outer sect disciple, and the detailed introduction to the sect Hu Yunfei had given him. Then, he closed his eyes to think more. 1. This mission didn't seem to be a difficult one. A few years ago, Hu Yunfei had accepted a mission outside of the sect, and would check back in every month with news. That was a common arrangement for disciples who took on long-term missions. However, 2 months ago, contact was lost, and no news had come back. Therefore, this new mission had been handed down. 3 outer sect disciples would be sent to investigate, with no specific instructions regarding the clues they were to gather. Search missions like this were common within the sect. All the disciples had to do was investigate a bit, turn up some clues, and then come back to the sect to let someone follow up further. Furthermore, for an outer sect disciple to go missing wasn't a very important matter as far as the sect was concerned. Of course, they were still disciples, so the matter had to be handled eventually. That was why missions like this existed in the first place. Bai Xiaochun thought about it further, and after weighing all the options and facts, clenched his teeth. Fine, I'll take the mission. Panting, eyes bloodshot, he immediately began to concoct more medicine. If he was going to go out of the sect on a mission, then he needed to have a major breakthrough with his undying iron skin. 2 days later, Bai Xiaochun's body was shaking, and his skin was vibrating. Suddenly, a wave of blackness spread out across him, which quickly vanished. However, if you looked closely, you could just barely see red streaks of light flashing across him. The black is iron, the red is bronze. When he pushed down on his skin, a sound like ringing metal echoed out. Next, he shot to his feet and confirmed that he was much faster than before. After a few more tests, he leapt up into the air and pinched his thumb and index finger together. There were no cracking sounds this time, but rather muffled booms. They weren't very loud, and yet Bai Xiaochun could tell that this move of his was at least twice as powerful as before. Breakthrough with my undying iron skin, he thought excitedly. As of this moment, he was a bit more confident regarding the mission. It's too bad I can only concoct Tier 1 spirit medicine appropriate for the 5th level of Qi condensation and lower. Bai Xiaochun stood there in the workshop feeling a bit disappointed. However, time was limited, and he simply couldn't produce the type of Tier 2 spirit medicine appropriate for the 8th level of Qi condensation and lower. Because of that, his cultivation base couldn't progress very much, and remained in the great circle of the 6th level of Qi condensation. Tomorrow at dawn I leave the sect, he thought anxiously. This would be his first time truly leaving the sect since he had joined, and he didn't feel safe at all. In fact, he even took out the shield he had acquired from Chen Fei and performed a threefold spirit enhancement on it. That didn't leave him feeling very safe, though. Next, he performed spirit enhancements on the leather coats he had worn in the competition. After more thought, he went out in the middle of the night and found Big Fatty Zhang to borrow his big black walk that supposedly had an earth flame spell formation built into it. Even still, he didn't feel at ease. However, there was nothing more to be done. Looking very anxious, he returned, not to the medicine concocting pavilion, but his courtyard, where he waited for the sun to rise. Qian Daijin, you just wait until I get to Foundation establishment. Then I'll show you a thing or two. Bai Xiaochun was more nervous than ever, and his eyes were completely bloodshot. He was scared of dying, after all, and now that he was no longer a newcomer to the sect, he was well aware of how the cultivation world worked. For the entire night, his imagination went wild as he thought about all the bad things that could happen, until eventually, the sun rose. 1. Hu Yunfei showed Bai Xiaochun around the sect in Chapter 14. At dawn, when the first ray of sunlight poked out into the sky, Bai Xiaochun felt his identity medallion vibrating. He stood there at the front of his courtyard, looked back at what had been his home for the past 2 years, and let out a long sigh. I'm definitely going to need to be very careful. I absolutely must not lose my poor little life. Bai Xiaochun had a very anxious look on his face. He had 8 layers of leather coats on, and was wearing Big Fatty Zhang's huge black walk on his back. Although he was actually relatively skinny, having dressed up in this fashion made him look almost spherical. With a very serious look, Bai Xiaochun left Fragrant Cloud Peak and headed toward the main gate that marked the border of the South Bank. On the way, the numerous disciples who looked at him all stared in shock at his unusual getup. He scowled miserably the entire time, and whenever he ran into people he knew, he would simply wave goodbye to them. Soon he was approaching the main gate, whereupon he saw 2 people who had arrived ahead of him. One of them was a young man sitting cross-legged in meditation. The other was a young woman who was pacing back and forth in front of the gate, but who currently had her back to him, and yet looked familiar. Du Lingfei? He thought, a look of shock appearing on his face. It was at this point that Du Lingfei also caught sight of him, and her jaw dropped. Then she noticed what he was wearing, and her brow furrowed. You're the last person in the team going to investigate elder brother Hu's whereabouts? She asked. Yeah, what a coincidence, he replied with a dry cough. Then he looked from Du Lingfei over toward the young man. Although his face was expressionless, a murderous aura rippled off of him, and as soon as Bai Xiaochun looked over at him, he opened his eyes and looked back, an enigmatic half-smile on his face. Bai Xiaochun's heart twitched. After analyzing the matter, he had come to the conclusion that the easiest way for Qian Daijin to do something to him was to place a friend within the mission group. Then, after they all left the sect, that friend could strike at him secretly. At the moment, he found both Du Lingfei and this young man to be worthy of suspicion. And yet, he acted completely at ease, and even smiled widely at the young man. Bai Xiaochun at your service, he said. Elder brother, you are. The young man smiled back and replied, Feng Yan of Green Crest Peak. Bai Xiaochun quickly clasped hands in respect. Oh, elder brother Feng, I should have known it was you. At first glance you're obviously an extraordinary individual. This is my first mission outside of the sect, so I really hope you can show me how it's done, elder brother Feng. It only took a moment for Bai Xiaochun to assess that Feng Yan's cultivation base was at the 7th level of Qi condensation. No problem. You flatter me. A flicker of scorn passed through Feng Yan's eyes. The only reason he'd agreed to take the mission was that inner sect disciple Qian Daijin had promised him a lucrative reward to secretly kill Bai Xiaochun. As far as he was concerned, that wouldn't be difficult at all. All he had to do was be careful and make it look like an accident. Bai Xiaochun was as good as dead. The only thing he had to be careful about was to make sure that Du Lingfei didn't see. Of course, he was mostly convinced that Du Lingfei had taken the mission for the same reason he had, because of Qian Daijin. As for Du Lingfei, she was currently frowning. She had never imagined that accepting a mission outside the sect would result in her being stuck with one of the people she despised the most. After all, no one had forced her to take this mission, she had selected it on her own. Although there might be some danger associated with it, it was a relatively simple mission with a hefty reward of merit points. She had been stuck in the great circle of the 5th level of Qi condensation for some time now, and needed some cloud-soaring incense to break through, which of course required merit points. As soon as she thought about cloud-soaring incense, her revulsion for Bai Xiaochun stirred. The lily-livered rat, she thought, glaring at Bai Xiaochun in disgust. She especially despised his sphere-like appearance with all the clothes and the black walk, which made it more obvious than ever that he feared death. Snorting coldly, she completely ignored Bai Xiaochun and turned toward Feng Yan to clasp hands and bow. Elder brother Feng, now that we're all here, please produce the wind skiff. The sooner we get this mission done, the sooner we can come back. Feng Yan gave a slight smile, then slapped his bag of holding, causing a white beam of light to fly out. A blast of wind could be felt as the beam transformed into a small white ship, about 6 meters long. Fluctuations of spiritual power emanated off of the ship, transforming into an extraordinary pressure. Bai Xiaochun looked it over and immediately blurted, "Elder brother Feng, what's that?" This was his first time seeing anything like this. As the ship hovered there in midair, it was obvious that it was some type of vehicle. Even as Du Lingfei's eyes flickered with scorn, Feng Yan smiled. This is a wind skiff. When missions require us to go some distance away from the sect, we can rent ships like this from the sect to make things easier. We can save some of our own spiritual power, at the cost of some spirit stones. With that, he leapt up into the air and settled down into the ship. Du Lingfei quickly followed, as did Bai Xiaochun. The ship wasn't very big, and was somewhat cramped, but there was still plenty of room for the three of them. Bai Xiaochun sat down in the very back and began to study ship even more closely. The more he looked at it, the more he realized that it truly was an incredible item. One of these days, he murmured, I'm going to get one of these for myself. Seeing Bai Xiaochun looking like a complete country bumpkin, Du Lingfei couldn't hold back from sarcastically remarking, even if you sold yourself into slavery you couldn't afford one. Bai Xiaochun looked over at Du Lingfei, measured her up, then nodded. True, but if I sold you, I could definitely afford one. You. Du Lingfei's phoenix-like eyes went wide, and she was just about to say something more when Feng Yan sent the wind skiff flying off into the distance in a beam of prismatic light. As they sped along at top speed, whistling through the air, a shield sprang up around the ship, creating a barrier against the wind. Although they could hear the wind buffeting the shield, the inside of the ship was very calm. Meanwhile, back on Fragrant Cloud Peak, in the Journeyman Apothecary Hall, Elder Shu, who had been in charge of the promotion test, was looking at a jade slip and frowning slightly. The Hall of Justice circumvented Fragrant Cloud Peak to force Bai Xiaochun into accepting an outside mission? After examining the jade slip a bit further, his frown faded away. After examining the details of the mission, he realized that although there might be some danger involved, it was nothing deadly. Then he thought about what Li Qinghao had mentioned about Bai Xiaochun's personality. If the kid's a bit lazy, then some punishment isn't uncalled for. Finally, he put the jade slip down and continued to concoct medicine. At the same time, Qian Daijin stood outside his immortals cave in the inner sect, watching the ship flying off into the distance, and a cold smile appeared on his face. With Feng Yan's cultivation base, secretly killing Bai Xiaochun should be as easy as flipping over his hand. Bai Xiaochun, you might have exceptional skill with plants and vegetation, but unfortunately, you'll never have a chance to do anything with it. You're dead. A sinister gleam appeared deep within Qian Daijin's eyes. Smiling, he turned and headed back into his immortal's cave. The azure sky stretched out in all directions. Bai Xiaochun sat there on the ship, feeling somewhat nervous, but at the same time looking out excitedly as the scenery changed. Off in the distance he saw numerous mountain peaks that looked like swords sticking up into the sky, part of a mountain range that looked like a slumbering dragon. There was also a massive, shocking river. The Heavenspan River, he said, taking a deep breath. After becoming an outer sect disciple, he had done a lot of research, and had learned that the entire cultivation world relied on the Heavenspan River. It was actually the source of all spiritual energy. That was why all of the sects were located in areas near it. Furthermore, the further you went into the upper reaches of the river, the stronger the spiritual energy was. Although the Spirit Stream sect was technically in the lower reaches, even that position had allowed them to stand strong and tall for 10,000 years. According to what Bai Xiaochun had read, the Spirit Stream sect hadn't always existed in its current position. It had previously been located in the Delta region. But then an extraordinary patriarch had appeared among the countless sects and cultivator clans there. After distinguishing himself in intense fighting, he gained the approval of a higher-ranking sect, and thus earned the qualifications to establish his own sect in the lower reaches. Supposedly, the sects in the upper reaches of the Heavenspan River are so powerful that the Spirit Stream sect can't even compare to them. Furthermore, according to the legends, there are even more terrifying sects at the source of the river. Bai Xiaochun forced himself to calm down, and reminded himself that he needed to be extra careful in this mission. Off in the distance, the Heavenspan River looked golden, almost like a huge churning sea. Furthermore, hugging the river were 4 towering mountain peaks. That must be the north bank of the Spirit Stream sect, Bai Xiaochun thought. Also visible was the main peak of the Spirit Stream sect, which arched over the Heavenspan River like a huge bridge. Mount Daoseed. Bai Xiaochun had actually seen all of this when Li Qinghao had first brought him to the Spirit Stream sect. However, at that time he had been a mere mortal. Now that he was an outer sect disciple, he got a completely different feeling when looking at it. The ship shot away from the sect at top speed, following the rippling water beneath as they headed deeper into the lower reaches. Junior sister Du, junior brother Bai, I presume both of you have already examined the details of the mission, Feng Yan said coolly, his voice so light that it was almost hard to hear. We're heading to an area in the lower reaches of the Heavenspan River called the Fallen Star Mountains. Junior brother Hu's last message came from that area. The Fallen Star Mountains mark the boundary of the Spirit Stream sect's sphere of influence. The rest of the mountains count as the territory of the Bloodstream sect. We might find ourselves in some danger on this mission. However, by preparing ourselves mentally, and also being as cautious as possible, we will likely avoid any major problems. However, our final destination is quite a distance away, and will take quite a few spirit stones to get there. Most of our time on this mission will be spent traveling, but with our windskiff, we will be able to bypass some of the more difficult terrain. With that, a cold gleam flickered in his eyes before he closed them in meditation. Du Lingfei ignored Bai Xiaochun and began to perform breathing exercises. Bai Xiaochun felt more vigilant than ever. Despite also sitting cross-legged and closing his eyes, he was really pondering which among these two had been sent by Qian Daijin. It's unlikely to be Du Lingfei, he thought. Which means, there's an 80 to 90% chance that it's Feng Yan. A day later, when the first spirit stone was completely used up, Feng Yan put the windskiff away, and the 3 of them stood atop a mountain peak under the evening sky, watching the sun slowly set over the horizon. Soon, darkness blanketed the lands. At the foot of the mountain, the dense jungle echoed with the roars of animals and wild beasts. The air was very humid. After we get past this jungle, we can rest, Feng Yan said coolly. What do you two think? He looked at Du Lingfei and Bai Xiaochun. It's dark, Bai Xiaochun pointed out. That jungle might have some dangerous wild beasts in it. Why don't we just fly over it with the windskiff? Take a break on your own, if you want, Du Lingfei said with a cold snort. It's just some trees. Not concealing her disdain for Bai Xiaochun's fear of death, she flashed into motion, heading directly toward the jungle. A glimmer of scorn stirred deep in Feng Yan's eyes, but he smiled nonetheless and then shot down the mountain. Bai Xiaochun frowned as he watched the 2 of them leaving. Finally he sighed, and followed them down the mountain toward the jungle, more vigilant than ever. The humidity increased when they entered the jungle, and there were even some spots which were marshes or bogs. Animals appeared occasionally, but these were 3 Qi condensation cultivators. They didn't slow down at all as they proceeded along, gradually forging their way deeper and deeper into the jungle. Time passed. Eventually, the night deepened. By the time the moon rose, they were already about halfway to the other side. So far they hadn't encountered any fierce beasts. The trip had gone very smoothly. Bai Xiaochun was in the rear position, and even the slightest sound or movement would cause him to leap in fright. Du Lingfei's scorn grew stronger. "Watch out," Bai Xiaochun suddenly blurted, stopping in place with a very uneasy expression on his face. Du Lingfei laughed coldly, and was just about to say something sarcastic when all of a sudden, a wild wind blasted toward them, along with an acrid odor. Du Lingfei's face flickered, and she looked out into the jungle to see countless eyes staring back. They were bright red, and in almost the exact same instant that she saw them, the sound of flapping wings could be heard. Numerous bats appeared, each one about the size of a hand, flying in their direction. "Two-headed bats," exclaimed Feng Yan. "Their venom dries up the blood and seals the throat. Split up and meet at the mountain peak on the other side of the jungle." Face flickering, Feng Yan burst into motion, heading off at top speed. Du Lingfei's pupils constricted, and she waved her hand in front of her, throwing out a paper talisman. As it burned, a blue light spread out, covering her with a shield and also increasing her speed. She picked another direction and sped off. Looking over her shoulder as she left, she was shocked to find that Bai Xiaochun had long since disappeared. Bai Xiaochun had begun fleeing as soon as the wind kicked up. Of course, Bai Xiaochun was very careful and perceptive, and was extremely attuned to danger. Even as he fled, the bats approached, causing a droning sound to fill the air. They quickly split up into 3 groups, which began to pursue the 3 disciples. A cold smile appeared on Feng Yan's face as he sped through the jungle, and he quickly put away the stick of incense that he had just been holding. That stick of incense was what had attracted the bats, and was also why he had chosen to pass through this jungle on the way to their mission. He had sensed that this would be a likely location to contain 2-headed bats. The weakest of them are at the 3rd level of qi condensation. "Bai Xiaochun, don't blame me that someone wants you dead." Laughing coldly, he slapped his bag of holding to produce a wooden stick. After blowing a breath of air onto the stick, it ignited with black flames that caused the bats to let out piercing shrieks. Apparently, they hated those flames, and thus instantly dispersed. Feng Yan smiled and then continued onward, feeling much more at ease. As for Bai Xiaochun, he was speeding along through the jungle being pursued by numerous bats. However, the bats couldn't match his speed, and before long, there was quite a distance between the two of them. Occasionally, a beam of sword light would flash out, and a bat would scream and fall out of the air. Bai Xiaochun ran along, and after enough time had passed for an incense stick to burn, he looked over his shoulder and frowned. It sure was strange for all those bats to suddenly show up, he thought. He walked back a bit and found one of the bats he had killed with a flying sword, and after examining it closely, his eyes gleamed. "These aren't ordinary 2-headed bats, they're violet vein bats. They're just as venomous, but they're different from common 2-headed bats in that their fangs are the main ingredient for the Tier 2 spirit medicine blood-burning incense. Back in the sect, you can sell fangs like this for 50 merit points apiece." Bai Xiaochun was immediately delighted. Not very many people would recognize that these bats were actually listed in the 5th volume of Spirit Creatures. Feeling very excited, he began to collect the corpses of the bats. It didn't take long before he had 10 bats, from which he began to extract the fangs. "These bats aren't that strong after all," he said, chuckling. Soon, a shield sprang up around him, and he began to search through the jungle. Before long, an entire group of violet vein bats was flying toward him. He quickly performed an incantation gesture with his right hand, sending a flying sword bursting out toward the bats. Its speed was incredible, and before they could even get close to him, miserable shrieks filled the air, and numerous bats began to fall to the ground. The few that made it past the sword slammed into his shield and were sent spinning away. Bai Xiaochun collected the dead bats. Realizing that he was actually in no danger, he felt more at ease than ever. Puffing his chest out proudly, he continued to search through the jungle. It was in that fashion that he made his way along, collecting more and more fangs. 4 hours later, Feng Yan made his way out of the jungle to the appointed meeting spot on the mountain peak. There, he sat down cross-legged, a slight smile on his face as he waited. Another 2 hours passed, and Du Lingfei shot out from the trees, looking very bedraggled. As she sped up the mountain, she looked back anxiously at the dark jungle. Eventually, she reached Feng Yan, and realized that Bai Xiaochun was nowhere to be seen. "Bai Xiaochun hasn't come out yet?" she asked. Feng Yan sighed and shook his head. I wish junior brother Bai all the best. Unfortunately, two-headed bats are most active at night. If we go back in looking for him, we would be in a lot of danger. In order to make things look even more realistic, he didn't rest, but instead craned his neck anxiously toward the jungle, as if he were waiting for Bai Xiaochun to appear. Du Lingfei maintained her silence. Although she hated Bai Xiaochun, she didn't hate him so much that she wished him dead. After all, they were fellow members of the same sect. Finally, she sat down cross-legged and looked down at the jungle, sighing. Time passed, and soon it was almost dawn. After waiting through the entire night without seeing Bai Xiaochun, Du Lingfei was getting a very uneasy feeling. Feng Yan rose to his feet. After having stayed up the entire night, his eyes were bloodshot as he looked dejectedly toward the jungle. If he hasn't appeared by now, I'm afraid it means that Bai Xiaochun has met with disaster. It's all my fault. If I hadn't suggested to go through the jungle, junior brother Bai wouldn't have. Elder brother Feng, don't blame yourself, Du Lingfei said. Who would ever have thought that there would be two-headed bats in this place? Maybe Bai Xiaochun isn't dead yet. Besides, if he is dead, then as fellow disciples, we should go retrieve his corpse. She was unsure of exactly what sort of emotions she was experiencing, which was a very strange sensation. Although Bai Xiaochun annoyed her, she somehow felt disturbed. After all, there was no deep grudge between the two of them. Feng Yan sighed and nodded seriously. You're right, junior sister Du. No matter what has happened, we can't give up on him. With that, the two of them prepared to head back down the mountain to begin the search. However, it was only a moment later that they caught sight of Bai Xiaochun strolling out from within the trees, yawning. As soon as he was out of the jungle itself, he stretched lazily. Du Lingfei's eyes went wide, and Feng Yan almost couldn't believe what he was seeing as Bai Xiaochun casually began to walk up the mountain path. He almost looked like he had just woken up from a good night's sleep. He seemed excited and energetic, as opposed to Feng Yan and Du Lingfei, who were weary from a night without rest. Soon, Bai Xiaochun was at the top of the mountain. When he caught sight of Feng Yan and Du Lingfei, he hurried over and called out, "Good morning. Elder brother Feng, elder sister Du, that jungle is way too scary. I almost lost my little life." Bai Xiaochun truly had rested well that night. After clearing the entire jungle of bats, not only had he profited handsomely, he'd found the bat's cave, where he had experienced wonderful night of sleep. An unsightly expression could be seen on Du Lingfei's face as she glared at Bai Xiaochun. Snorting coldly, she thought back to the complicated feelings she had felt, and suddenly felt even more annoyed with Bai Xiaochun. A cold glitter passed through Feng Yan's eyes, although his expression was one of joy. "Junior brother Bai, I'm so glad to see you safe. We worried about you the entire night." Bai Xiaochun chuckled, and although his expression seemed normal, deep within his eyes, a cold gleam flickered. Soon, the three of them were on their way again, seated in the ship. Considering what had just happened, Bai Xiaochun suggested that they fly on the ship at night and proceed along on foot during the day. In rare fashion, Du Lingfei agreed, and as for Feng Yan, after a moment of thought, he nodded. Thus, they proceeded along down the Heavenspan River as they headed through the lower reaches. A month passed. This was the farthest Bai Xiaochun had ever traveled in his entire life. He saw numerous mountains and jungles, places where there was no sign of human habitation at all, and everything was like a huge wilderness. At one point in their travels, the ground began to quake, and Bai Xiaochun looked off into the distant mountains to see something completely astonishing. It was an enormous giant covered in thick fur, which caused the ground to shudder with each step it took. The sight of the giant caused Bai Xiaochun to gasp. One night when they were flying along, lightning crashed off in the distance, and Bai Xiaochun saw an enormous bird that was just as large as fragrant Cloud Peak. As it whistled along through the air, countless bolts of lightning danced across its body. The mere sight of such a creature flying along in the middle of the night was completely astonishing. The most memorable thing Bai Xiaochun saw was during the daytime when he caught sight of a beast on the south bank of the river. It had 4 stumpy legs, and a head as huge as a mountain. Suddenly, a huge 30,000-meter golden crocodile burst out from within the Heavenspan River and gobbled up the first creature. As the crocodile sank back down into the water, it cast a cold glance at Bai Xiaochun and the others. That single glance caused their minds to reel, and blood to ooze out of the corners of their mouths. Splitting pain tore at their eyes, and it took a long moment for them to recover. Bai Xiaochun shivered and then muttered, terrifying. The outside is so terrifying. Although Feng Yan had been on many missions outside the sect, this was his first time traveling so far away. Even his scalp numbed after what had just happened, let alone Du Lingfei, who was petrified. Thankfully, none of the incredibly powerful creatures they encountered showed any interest in attacking them. At the most, they would look over curiously. Apparently, the auras cast off by the group of three caused such creatures steer clear of them. Bai Xiaochun got the feeling that it was because they were disciples of the Spirit Stream sect. Although this area was far away from the sect, it was still within their sphere of influence. Despite the fear the group felt, they continued onward. After the first month of travel, they made contact with the sect on a pre-appointed day, informing them of their current location. The same thing happened after the second month. It was around that time that they reached the area in the Fallen Star Mountains, which was the border of the Spirit Stream sect's territory. Along the way, Feng Yan had considered making a secret strike against Bai Xiaochun, but the things he was seeing along the journey left him unnerved. He was in no mood for fighting, and when you coupled that with how cautious Bai Xiaochun was being, and how close he stuck to Du Lingfei, Feng Yan was simply too apprehensive, and couldn't find a chance to make his move. In the end, he was forced to simply bide his time. When Feng Yan looked at Bai Xiaochun, an imperceptibly sinister flicker could be seen in his eyes. So, he's really determined to kill me, huh? Bai Xiaochun thought, eyes narrowing. Hates me that much. Bai Xiaochun was getting worried. He was a perceptive person, and was now very sure of what was going on in Feng Yan's head. The Fallen Star Mountains formed a mountain range that swept from north to south. They looked endless, like an enormous sleeping dragon that split apart the lands. In fact, even the sky looked different above the mountains, almost as if it were tinged with blood. According to the legends, many years ago, a star had fallen from the skies and slammed into the earth, causing some of the lands to collapse, and other parts to rise up into the form of this mountain range. The mountains were covered with dense jungle and filled with wild beasts. However, numerous rare types of plants and vegetation could be found there. Because of that, there were always cultivators willing to go in and brave the danger, however terrifying it might seem. These are the Fallen Star Mountains, Du Lingfei said. The long journey had left her exhausted, so to catch sight of their final destination after all this time caused her to sigh with relief. The last messages sent to the sect by Junior Brother Hu came from this area, Feng Yan said, producing a magical device from his bag of holding. A feng shui compass. The feng shui compass had a silver needle on it, which was currently spinning around in circles. According to sect rules, disciples on outside missions are supposed to notify the sect of their location every month. This spirit stream compass should help us locate Junior Brother Hu's last known position. Even as he spoke, the silver needle on the feng shui compass suddenly pointed off in one particular direction. Got it, Feng Yan said, flashing into motion. Du Lingfei's expression flickered as she followed along behind him. Bai Xiaochun looked out over the Fallen Star Mountains, and the thick vegetation which covered them. It was like a sea of plants, within which could be heard the cries of various beasts. Even the occasional roar echoed out. Bai Xiaochun had a very serious expression on his face as he activated the shield from his jade pendant. With that in place, not even the slightest breeze would get past him unnoticed. Only then did he cautiously follow after Feng Yan. Feng Yan and Du Lingfei proceeded along without pausing for a moment, speeding along through the Fallen Star Mountains until they found themselves deep in a valley. The valley was filled with trees that had been growing together for so many years that their branches were all interlocked. The knotted and gnarled bark added to the effect. If it were nighttime, the entire scene would be extremely terrifying. After proceeding along through the valley for 2 hours, they suddenly came to a stop. Feng Yan looked down at the feng shui compass, the needle of which was pointing toward a tree with a trunk so wide that 10 people could circle around it with arms extended. Feng Yan looked at Bai Xiaochun and then pointed toward the huge tree. Junior Brother Bai, please go investigate. Bai Xiaochun hesitated for a moment, then looked the tree over. Seeing nothing initially suspicious, he tapped the jade pendant hanging at his waist, causing the green shield to grow a bit stronger. He also placed some paper talismans onto his body before finally edging closer. So afraid of dying, and yet you still want to practice cultivation? Du Lingfei gave a cold harumph. She had never liked Bai Xiaochun, so even though she herself was afraid of the dangers they had witnessed, to see him so incredibly terrified of dying made her look down on him even more. Bai Xiaochun didn't have the time to worry about Du Lingfei. Cautiously approaching the tree, he noticed a portion of bark that seemed to have grown recently. Taking out a flying sword, he cut away that portion of the tree and found that a jade slip was hidden inside. After removing the jade slip from the tree, Bai Xiaochun scanned it with divine sense, whereupon his expression flickered, and he tossed the slip over to Feng Yan. Within that jade slip was a single fragment of information. I found some other clues, and I'm going to the Luokan clan to get proof. After looking at it for a moment, Feng Yan frowned, and then handed the jade slip to Du Lingfei. Du Lingfei looked at it, whereupon her expression turned grim. The Luokan clan, she murmured after a long moment. Then she turned to stare deeper into the Fallen Star Mountains. These mountains were very large, and filled with numerous natural resources. Considering that this place was on the very edge of Spirit Stream Sect territory, where it bordered with the territory of the Bloodstream Sect, it was only natural that the Spirit Stream Sect would have the area guarded. Those guards were none other than the Luokan clan. The Luokan clan was a relatively large clan, which had stood guard in the Fallen Star Mountains for 1,000 years. Every generation of the clan had foundation establishment patriarchs. Generally speaking, the mere threat posed by such people was more than enough to help them in their duties of guardianship. In fact, the mission instructions even said to make contact with the Luokan clan if they ran into any danger. However, Hu Yunfei's jade slip seemed to indicate that the Luokan clan was where he had been heading to find some sort of evidence. After that was when he lost contact. What do you guys think? Feng Yan asked. Should we go check out the Luokan clan? Feng Yan glanced over casually at Bai Xiaochun and Du Lingfei. Bai Xiaochun immediately said, Elder brother Feng, elder sister Du, having found this jade slip, our mission is complete. We should put safety first. What's the point in going on? This entire place made Bai Xiaochun feel as if an invisible pressure was weighing down on him. Du Lingfei hesitated for a moment. If they went back now, they would only be able to acquire the minimum amount of merit points. However, if they investigated further, they might be able to get more. Feng Yan could see that Du Lingfei was hesitating, and he frowned, thinking about how going back now might reduce the chances he had to kill Bai Xiaochun. After a moment, he said, I think we should go to the Luokan clan and look around. We've come all the way here, how could we simply go back now? After we find out exactly what befell junior brother Hu, we might even be able to get help from the Luokan clan in finding him. If we do, we'll be rewarded with many more merit points. Furthermore, as long as we don't go into the depths of the Fallen Star Mountains, we should be relatively safe. Besides, if you're worried about the Luokan clan, don't forget that all of the cultivator clans in Spirit Stream Sect territory have special seals placed into their blood, making it impossible for them to turn traitor. How could they possibly treat us with any disrespect? After he finished speaking, Feng Yan looked over slowly at Du Lingfei. She nodded. After all, what he said made sense. Very well, we'll go to the Luokan clan to look around. Who knows, maybe junior brother Hu left the Luokan clan and then went missing. Seeing that she had agreed, Feng Yan smiled. Then he turned to look at Bai Xiaochun, and his gaze grew a bit colder. Frowning, Bai Xiaochun asked, we accomplished the mission, why let ourselves get dragged into side issues? If you're so scared, then just don't come with us, Du Lingfei said, turning a cold shoulder to Bai Xiaochun as she headed off. Junior brother Bai, Feng Yan said, I'm responsible for evaluating our performance on this task. We're supposed to make our decisions unanimously. If you don't come with us, it will make it hard to make my evaluation. With an enigmatic smile, he began to follow Du Lingfei. In his opinion, Bai Xiaochun was sure to come along. If he didn't, Du Lingfei would be able to corroborate the fact that they had committed dereliction of duty. When that happened, the Hall of Justice surely wouldn't let things slide. Bai Xiaochun's face darkened, and his blood began to surge through his veins as he stared with bloodshot eyes at Feng Yan walking away. He might be afraid of death, but as of this point, he was coming to the conclusion that he needed to take control of the situation. Only by settling things with Feng Yan could he ensure that his own position was stable. Feng Yan, you're forcing my hand, he thought. After standing there reticently for a few breaths of time, he bowed his head for a moment, then strode forward to follow Du Lingfei and Feng Yan. Soon, they disappeared into the jungle. 4 hours later, they were still hurrying along. Evening was falling, and the sun was setting, ensuring that the jungle was slowly getting darker and darker. We're here, Feng Yan suddenly said. The three of them stopped walking and looked off into the jungle. Up ahead, the trees thinned out, and numerous limestone boulders could be seen protruding out of the ground. A large number of courtyard houses were visible, which were organized into the larger form of a mansion that could apparently house hundreds of people. At this time of evening, a clan would normally be at its most active, but unexpectedly, the mansion was completely dark and quiet. Considering the darkness of the sky, the entire place seemed almost abandoned. The only light provided was by two lanterns which hung at the main gate. Even though there was no wind, the two lanterns swayed back and forth, casting flickering shadows onto the guardian stone lions beneath them. The scene caused Feng Yan and Du Lingfei's faces to flicker. As for Bai Xiaochun, as soon as he laid eyes on the mansion, a feeling of impending danger rose up in his heart. It felt like every inch of flesh on his body wanted to scream. "Something's off about," Feng Yan said, his heart thumping. However, before he could even finish speaking, the main gate slammed open, and a vile wind blew out. At the same time, a figure emerged noiselessly through the gate. The courtyard gate opened, and Du Lingfei, Feng Yan and Bai Xiaochun were completely on guard as they peered inside. Bai Xiaochun was so nervous that he started slapping paper talismans all over himself. The figure which had just appeared held a lantern in its hand, and stood in the opened gate, wreathed in shadows as it gazed at the three of them. "Why, might I ask, have the three of you come to the Luokan clan on this dark evening?" The flickering light of the lantern just barely revealed a young man, standing there looking at them calmly. He wore a long, green robe, and his face was pale and devoid of any color of blood. After seeing that it was a person who had appeared, Feng Yan and Du Lingfei breathed sighs of relief. Somehow, the creepy feeling they had experienced moments ago had subsided a bit. Feng Yan clasped hands and said, "Hello, fellow Taoist. We are disciples of the Spirit Stream sect, paying a visit to ask a few questions." By this point, Du Lingfei had noticed the numerous shields which were flickering around Bai Xiaochun, and her brow furrowed in response. Bai Xiaochun didn't notice Du Lingfei's look. For some reason, the fact that a young man had appeared hadn't caused his sensation of intense danger to lessen at all. "Ah, fellow Taoists from the Spirit Stream sect," the young man said. "Please, come in, and we can discuss matters." The flickering of the lantern cast shadows on the young man's face, making it difficult to see him clearly as he turned and walked off. The courtyard gate then opened wide to allow the three disciples to enter. Feng Yan hesitated for a moment, then walked through the gate. Du Lingfei followed along behind him. As for Bai Xiaochun, he looked around for a moment before gritting his teeth and cautiously entering the courtyard. Even as the large gate closed behind them, the two stone lions beneath the lanterns outside suddenly turned to look in the direction of the gate, their eyes flickering with a blood-colored light. Inside the courtyard was a green limestone path that wound through various plants and decorative rocks. Faint moonlight shone down, casting everything into partial shadow. The only light came from the lantern, which swayed back and forth in the young man's hand. The four of them walked along the path, surrounded by gloomy silence. This place almost seemed like a different world than the one beyond the gate. On the right-hand side of the path were several fruit trees, laden with red fruit. Strangely, despite a lack of any breeze within the courtyard, the leaves on those trees suddenly rustled. Du Lingfei and Feng Yan seemed more on guard than ever, and Bai Xiaochun, who was last in line, looked around cautiously in all directions. For some reason, those rustling fruit trees seemed very bizarre. Gradually, a smell like that of fresh blood rose up, faint but simultaneously distinct. Bai Xiaochun's heart began to thump, and he was just about to say something when, all of a sudden, fruit began to fall off of the fruit trees, landing on the ground and rolling toward Bai Xiaochun and the others. Strangely, faces could be seen on the fruit, childlike faces with broad smiles that almost seemed to have been painted on. "La la la, hello." Arms and legs sprouted out of the fruit, and as they ran toward Bai Xiaochun and the others, they clasped hands and then began to skip in circles around the shocked group of three. At the same time, the fruits began to cry out in excited voices. "Auntie said to be good and not cry. We can only laugh. Ripe fruit is the best fruit." Their voices were very charming and sweet as they danced around and began to sing children's lullabies. Now that they were so close, it was possible to smell a sweet fragrance wafting about. It was so sickly sweet, in fact, that upon inhaling it, Bai Xiaochun and the others felt as if they were about to puke their guts out. When the fruit got too close to the young man with the lantern, he completely ignored them, and even stepped on some of them, crushing them. However, the crushed fruits simply crawled back to their feet, smiling as they continued to dance and sing. What the hell are these things? Feng Yan exclaimed, eyes flickering. He waved his sleeve, causing a gust of wind to kick up and send some of the fruits flying away. After splatting onto the ground, they lurched back to their feet and rejoined the circle, laughing just as loudly as before. Bai Xiaochun felt goosebumps rising up all over him, and by this point he was fully surrounded by flickering shields. Du Lingfei looked at the fruits all holding hands and singing, and her facial expression flickered with fear. Pushing down the disgust in her heart, she gritted her teeth, and her phoenix-like eyes flashed with anger. She was just about to perform an incantation gesture when suddenly, the fruits' faces fell in terror. "Auntie's coming," they cried, running pell-mell back to the tree and leaping up into their original positions. Soon, their laughter and singing had faded away, and they looked like nothing more than ordinary fruit. The young man from the Luokan clan didn't look back at them, but they could hear his voice as he said, "Those are some spirit fruits the patriarch brought back from the depths of the Fallen Star Mountains. What do you think of their singing, fellow Taoists? They love to sing." Unsightly expressions appeared on the faces of Feng Yan and Du Lingfei as they followed along. Bai Xiaochun was still in the very back. Suddenly, the cold feeling of fear rose up inside of him as he realized that another set of footsteps could be heard. Step, step, step. It was impossible to determine when exactly this development had occurred, but as of this moment, there were clearly 5 people walking along the path. Perhaps those footsteps had been mingled in with theirs from the moment they had entered the courtyard, and they hadn't noticed because of the strange fruits. But now, in the silence that followed the fruit's outburst, the sound of the additional footsteps was extremely conspicuous. The echoing footfalls caused Bai Xiaochun to shiver. What was most frightening was that the footsteps were coming from right behind him. Suddenly, an icy breeze seemed to run down his back, as if someone were behind him, breathing on him. "Hey guys," he said, "did any of you realize there's another set of footsteps?" As the hairs on the back of Bai Xiaochun's neck rose up, Feng Yan's face flickered as he also detected the footsteps. Du Lingfei's pupils constricted, and she began to pant. The 3 of them suddenly stopped walking, and as they did, the sound of the other footsteps vanished. Bai Xiaochun's heart was pounding. Gritting his teeth, he slowly turned his head to find himself staring into the eyes of a young woman wearing a red robe. Her robe swayed gently, and her face was as ashen, as if she were dead. She smiled oddly at Bai Xiaochun for a moment before her lips twitched, and she said, "This fire won't do, help me." The suddenness of what had just occurred caused Bai Xiaochun to leap into the air and scream. The red-robed young woman suddenly transformed into a streak of light that vanished in the blink of an eye. Bai Xiaochun's face was pale white as he looked around, but nothing was there, except for the echoing sound of his own scream. Du Lingfei and Feng Yan looked around in fright. Although they didn't see any unusual figure like Bai Xiaochun did, their hearts were still pounding. Then, a woman's voice suddenly rang out, singing a song. The lyrics drifted throughout the courtyard, strange and mysterious, almost like a lullaby being sung to soothe a baby. The mere sound of it caused the darkness to seem even more spine-tingling than before. "Good little baby, it's time to sleep. The wind is blowing and the flames do leap. Don't you weep and don't make a peep." "Enough with the parlor tricks," Feng Yan blurted, clearly nervous. He instantly performed an incantation gesture, summoning a flying sword, which began to swirl around him. Simultaneously, the young man with the lantern turned around to look at them. The flickering light from the lantern made him appear stranger than ever. "What are you standing there for? Come on, let's keep going." He smiled, a smile that was somehow very abnormal. Feng Yan took a deep breath, and then his eyes glinted with a fierce light as he said, "No, we're not going anywhere. Look, we're here to investigate the disappearance of one of our fellow disciples. Fellow Taoist, do you happen to remember anyone like us coming around here about 5 months ago?" Du Lingfei had already pulled out a magical device, and her eyes were shining in concentration. "No, I don't think so," replied the young man. His softly spoken words floated out into the air and seemed to harmonize with the woman's singing voice. "Fellow Taoist," Du Lingfei suddenly said, "how come none of your fellow clan members are around?" The young man's smile widened to the point of looking unnatural. "Oh, they're out on business. Are you done with your questions?" "Yes, we're done here," said Feng Yan. "We'll take our leave now." With that, he turned to walk the other way back down the path. Du Lingfei followed suit, and as for Bai Xiaochun, he had long since taken to flight, and was further on ahead of them. The young man's smile was now so wide that the sides of his mouth began to rip open, almost as if his head were about to be torn in half. If you don't want to go any further, the least you could do is stay behind to keep us company. The lantern suddenly turned a greenish color, making the entire courtyard even darker than before. Even as the words left the young man's mouth, he began to float through the air toward Feng Yan. Feng Yan's face fell, and he performed an incantation gesture and pointed out, sending his flying sword speeding toward the young man. A boom rang out as the young man let the sword stab through him. Then, his smile widened even further as he shot toward Feng Yan. Panting, Feng Yan fell back, simultaneously pulling out a black medicinal pill, which he threw down onto the ground. A rattling boom echoed out as the pill then exploded. The charging young man was hit by the blast and sent tumbling backward, his body riddled with wounds. However, he apparently didn't feel any pain whatsoever. Smiling the same as ever, he arced through the air as fast as a kite on a windy day, to once again charge toward Feng Yan. In the spot where the medicinal pill had exploded, numerous glowing lines were now visible, all of which emanated a strong aura of death as they began to form together, as if they were repairing themselves. As soon as he saw the designs on the ground, Feng Yan cried out in alarm, "There's a spell formation here. It's a shadow hell formation." At the same time, the green limestone beneath Du Lingfei's feet began to vibrate, and then eyes popped open upon them. Emaciated, corpse-like arms as skinny as twigs stretched out. Just beneath the surface of the skin of those arms were countless, worm-like creatures, wriggling and writhing. Those arms grabbed Du Lingfei's right leg. Voices rose up from the green limestone, sinister, fear-inspiring voices. "It hurts when you step on us. Come be with us." Du Lingfei's face was ashen. She quickly performed an incantation gesture and pointed out, causing a flag to fly out from her bag of holding. It instantly transformed into two mist beasts, which swirled around her defensively. Simultaneously, a flying sword appeared, and the sword light that shimmered out severed the hands which had grabbed onto her leg, allowing her to fall back. As for Bai Xiaochun, the woman's singing suddenly grew louder in his ears. "Don't you weep and don't make a peep." Thus, this episode comes to an end. Remember to like and comment so we can discuss the story together. Until we meet again in the next chapters.